Today we're going to talk about scientific literature and references, which sounds really boring, but it is kind of a really important step to get started when you want to do research. Actually, it's the first thing you usually do before you jump in the laboratory and try to do anything, because you really need to know what you're doing. What's the purpose of you going into the laboratory to do experiments? You know, if you're in a class and you're doing laboratory experiments that are part of a lesson plan, everything's kind of laid out for you as to what you're going to do. But when you're doing research, you want to design experiments ahead of time that have a purpose, that are trying to answer a question. And so before you can start designing experiments and deciding what experiments are appropriate to do and what experiments are really worth your time doing in the laboratory, you need to have some knowledge of the field that you're studying. You need to look at the background, see what other people have done, what other experiments have been done, see what worked, what did they find, and most importantly, what you want to try to do is identify what hasn't been done. What questions have people not been able to answer? And so scientific literature is the way that we communicate those ideas to each other in science. So it's important to be able to understand how to use scientific literature. And when you actually finish experiments and you go to write up your experiments and everything, you're expected to include the background that led you to do the experiments that you do in the laboratory. So that means you need to be able to reference, to cite other authors and show what they have done. Push this into, I'm actually going to keep it like this. This probably works better. And I'll hide this side here. Try to hide. Ribbon off and there we go. Okay, so during this presentation, this is kind of general outline that we're going to use for this presentation, and kind of in organized according to questions that you might ask when you're doing scientific literature review and using references. So first, how do I use scientific literature for my research? How can I actually use this as a tool? What is a scientific review article? This is kind of usually a starting point if you're just getting started in learning a particular field, and you need to very quickly learn a lot of background information. This is a good place to start, starting with a scientific review article. Then once you start learning about the field, you're going to look at original research articles. And we're competing with the blower right now, of course. So, my apologies. Hopefully, either I or Dr. Wakefield might be able to edit this portion of the video out. And now they're going away, so that's good. Okay, so after looking at a review article, what you would then start doing is looking at original research articles. And I've qualified this as peer review original research articles. And so what is a peer review original research article? So I'll answer that question for you. Then we want to go into actually searching for scientific articles. How do I find a scientific article? How do you go about reading an article? Once you find this, wonderful scientific article that is supposed to give you all this knowledge and information, how do you actually dissect it? How should you approach reading an article? Hint, reading from beginning to end is not always the most productive way to digest a scientific article. And then once you start actually doing some work, say you want to, maybe you want to present a review of the knowledge that you've acquired by doing some scientific literature research, you might put together a short presentation. Or maybe you've done experiments and you want to present the results of your experiments. Well, as part of that, you're expected to include some background regarding the work that's been done prior to you starting in the lab. So you need to know how to cite scientific articles, either for a paper, a post, or a presentation. And then as part of that, how do you actually manage references? So once you start doing research into the scientific literature, you're going to come across a lot of references that you want to be able to use in putting together your writing or putting together a post or a presentation. But that's a lot of information that you need to organize. So I want to show you there's a couple options for managing references. So I'll go through one of those in a little bit of detail. And then last, just show a quick example of creating an annotated bibliography, which is kind of a good place to start if you're writing a term paper or you're going to write your own scientific article. It's a good idea to have an annotated bibliography so it helps you organize your thoughts. Dating myself, but back I don't know if you guys learned this in high school, but back many years ago, they used to teach us to use note cards, little index cards, and you'd write down, at the top the reference, and then you'd fill up the card with information that you gleaned from reading that particular reference or research article. And so in this case, we can do everything electronically. So you can put together a Word file that has a list of the different references that you're using, and then within each one, you can put a little summary or annotation for each of the references. Okay, I think the worst of the sound is distractions are hopefully over. Okay, so a little bit of background for why we're doing this. So I'm going to use the metaphor of science as a jigsaw puzzle. What is science? Science is kind of trying to organize knowledge. And that means that we're trying to know everything that can be known, which means that there are some things that we don't know. And so kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, the areas of the jigsaw puzzle that all fit together and display a picture that has some meaning, that's knowledge that we already have. But there's whole areas outside of that we don't know. And one of the things to start off doing scientific research is you want to see where the boundaries are. What is the boundary between what is known and what is not known? And in addition to that, in some cases, there might be some information like, these two jigsaw pieces here, which is something that's known, but it's not clear how it fits in with the rest of the picture. It's not clear how it fits in with the rest of what's known of scientific knowledge. So before you start doing research, you first have to figure out what is the current state of knowledge. And then you can direct your research towards how are you going to contribute to expanding that knowledge? What areas of the unknown are you going to explore? And that will allow you to come up with questions that you can test by experimentation. So if you know, for example, that this spot here in this puzzle is missing, there's one piece of knowledge that is missing there. And if you could find out what is that unknown knowledge, then you could fill in that puzzle there, and that would make a better picture. So what we're trying to do by doing research is either expand or fill in gaps in our knowledge. And so one of the key things that, especially if you're getting ready to do research starting off, is to figure out where are the gaps in knowledge? Where can you contribute to that knowledge? And if you do that successfully, you know, when you get to be a graduate student or a primary investigator running your own laboratory, you present those ideas and put them into a grant proposal, and hopefully people appreciate that, hey, you're going to advance human knowledge, you're going to find something that nobody else knows, and they'll actually give you money to do that. But for most of you right now, you don't have to worry about that part. Your focus is on what can I learn? And can I learn something that nobody else knows, which would be really exciting. So when you're looking at scientific articles are like little pieces of a puzzle. Someone else has figured out, hey, there's this little piece of knowledge that nobody else knows, and I'm going to go out and find it. And they find one of these pieces of the puzzle, and in the best case, it fits in and makes a more complete picture. But in some cases, they might find a piece of the puzzle that nobody knows how it fits in, but they've done an experiment that shows some part of the puzzle. And then that leads the way for other people to look at, okay, how does this fit in with the rest of what we know? So when you start off doing scientific research, you want to really start off doing a review of scientific literature, and that'll show you what the boundaries of knowledge are. And then you can focus your research after that. Okay, so a good place to start if you're just getting started on a research topic, say you're going to join a lab for the summer, for example, and you've been told that you're doing research in a particular area, but maybe you don't know anything about that area. So a good place to start is to find a research or scientific review article. And I'm going to focus on right now using PubMed because it's free. There's some proprietary databases and things such as Scifinder that, for example, if you're doing research in organic chemistry, might be more appropriate for using because they focus on chemical information and chemical articles. But for doing research, which is my background in biomedical research, PubMed contains most of the research articles that I'm interested in, and has the additional advantage that it's free. So you can go to the National Library of Medicine, go to the website for PubMed, which is shown here, and you can use it basically just like you guys are probably used to using Google. You put in a search term and then just hit search, and it'll come up with a list of scientific articles. And then you can filter those articles. In this case, I filtered them by which ones have free full text articles available. That means that you don't have to pay a subscription. You don't have to be associated with the university library, but you can access this article for free. You don't have to pay for it. In addition to that, what's not shown down here towards lower down on the left side over here, I've also checked a box for review articles. So the list that's shown here includes just articles that are free, and it includes review articles. And in display options, you can sort the list of things that you found. In this case, it's sorted by best match. You can also sort by date. So if you want to make sure that you're looking at the latest and greatest information, you can sort by publication date. And so in this case, I'm searching for SARS coronavirus 2. And the first article that comes up as the best match is this article here that compares the different coronaviruses, compares SARS coronavirus 2, the SARS coronavirus that was discovered in 2002, and the MERS coronavirus as well. and gives a comparative overview. So if I was just getting started doing research in coronavirus and I wanted to focus, my efforts on trying to discover something new about SARS coronavirus 2, this might be a good place to start because I can get a general background of coronaviruses, and this does a comparison between the different coronaviruses. So this is probably a good place to start and start learning the background knowledge that I'm going to need to have before I start doing experiments in the lab. Okay. So when you look at a review article, what I've done here is click on the link for that particular article. In PubMed, it comes up with the title, the authors, and an abstract. So you can initially read the abstract and see if it looks like that article will give you the knowledge that you're trying to find. In addition to that, what's very important is over here, it has a clickable link that will take you to the full text of the article. And so if you click on that link, then you can actually download the article. And this is actually a PDF file. It has the entire article, so then you're ready to go ahead and read the article. And when you're reading the article, some of the things you want to focus on that hopefully this review article will be able to tell you is, first, why is this topic interesting? What is in this case, useful and applicable maybe in curing coronavirus or designing therapies for coronavirus? This article might be able to point you in directions of research that would be interesting. What is significant for research? How does this article kind of point you to what you're interested in doing for research? So a review article should tell you, a general background about what is currently known, and very importantly, it should highlight what is not yet known. A lot of times there might be an urgent question in a particular research field, and research review articles will usually highlight that. They'll say, hey, we know this, but we're missing this key piece of knowledge that might be crucial to developing therapies for coronavirus, for example. Review articles will also sometimes anticipate discoveries. So they might know who is working in a particular area. They can look at their background of what they've published, what discoveries they have made, and they can kind of anticipate what direction their research is going. So for instance, for an example, a lab might be working on developing a vaccine for coronavirus, and they might have published some of their preliminary work, and from the review article you might know what direction they're heading and what areas of discoveries might be coming up next. The other thing you can get from a review article is, what are active areas of research? What is everybody else doing in that field? So for instance, with coronavirus, which laboratories are working on vaccines? Which laboratories are working on therapeutic inhibitors for the virus that might stop replication of the virus inside cells? So you can find out who's actually doing the work. And one of the things you want to focus on when you're looking at review articles is who are the investigators that are actually doing the work. Which laboratories, which primary investigators are actually doing research in the field. Because when you start collecting references, you want to focus on those active laboratories, particularly ones that have a track record of making progress and finding things that are significant. And you want a review article is a good place to start, and then you can find out what are they doing right now. Usually a review article is dated. They're looking at research that was done last year. But if you identify someone who's doing exciting research, then you can look for articles that they've published in the past, months or a few weeks, and see where they headed since they last published and it was included in a review article. So a key thing to focus on is which laboratories, which primary investigators are actually doing the research. Okay, so you can use a review article kind of as a starting point for doing literature search. And so one of the first things you can do is look at the bibliography. So at the end of a review article, you'll have a list of all the references. And the nice thing about using a review article for this is they have included a brief description of what was useful, what they got out of reading that particular reference. And hang on a second, I think we have lost somebody. Okay. All right. So, so again, a review article is a good place to start doing your literature search. It's great to put in a search term in PubMed, do a general search, but you're going to end up with thousands of articles. How do you figure out which ones are important? Which ones are really in the area that you're interested in studying? So if you find a review article that's focused on that field of research that you're interested in studying, it's a good starting point for building up a collection of original research articles. And so the first thing you can do is look at the bibliography. When you go through and read the review article, you might highlight certain findings, certain experiments that have been done, and then you can use those references and you can read more about them. So the first few here that are shown in this bibliography are other review articles. So you might be interested in going further into the background and learning more about, say, for instance, the origin and evolution of pathogenic coronavirus that was published last year. So that might give you some more information. Since there's another review article, this particular review article would not include that information. They don't want to repeat information that's already been published. So you might have to look at 1 or 2 or 3 review articles to get a full scope of a particular field. And then you can, actually all the first articles here are review articles, but as you go through the references, there's probably 100 references in this review article. As you get further down, you'll see particular references that focus on particular original research that's been done. And you can use this bibliography as kind of a starting point for building up your own collection of research articles. Now, you can also use a review article. See if I can advance. There we go. If you go back to the PubMed site where you originally found this review article, over on the right side here are a couple of useful links. One of them is for similar articles. So maybe you found a review article that is interesting, but you want to see if other articles are available. You can click similar articles here, and it will pull up a list of other articles that have been published that cover a similar topic. So that's a good way of finding other review articles. It's also a good way to find original research as well. So similar articles will also pull up original research articles. And then the other thing that's useful, especially if you're looking at a review that maybe was published a year ago or 2 years ago, is you can look at citing articles. So other people that are doing research are doing the same thing as what we're doing here. They start off, they do a literature search, they find a review article. That review article helps direct them into what area of research they want to do and helps them identify a gap in knowledge that they want to try and elucidate. And once they've done their experiments, they publish their research, then they might go back and cite this review article because it gave them some background knowledge that they found useful. And so you can find out, this is a good way to find out what is kind of the cutting edge research in that particular field. See who's cited this review article and has provided knowledge that advances the field. So these two links here will bring up list of articles that might be useful in collecting citations or collecting references. Okay, so that's a review article. It's kind of a good place to start. Once you actually start adding to your collection, you're going to start looking primarily for original research articles. Original research articles are the results of research where someone's usually identified some gap in the knowledge and tries to address that, tries to answer particular questions. Now, I've highlighted here peer review research. And the reason for that is peer-reviewed research is kind of gold standard for scientific publishing. If you're looking at an original research article, especially at this stage, it's a good idea to limit yourself to what are called peer-reviewed original research. That means that when the authors submitted their article for publication, their article was critiqued. They had other people with knowledge of the field go through and read their article, identify where there might be problems with the article. The reviewers will also include at least one editor from the publication who has knowledge in the field. And all of them will make a judgment as to whether the article should be published. They might also present or give some feedback as to areas that need improvement. And sometimes there's a back and forth between the authors and the reviewers that eventually leads to refining the publication and hopefully in the best case, it ends up improving the publication before it is actually presented to the public. So in kind of the old-fashioned model for peer-reviewed original research articles, articles must be technically sound, and they also have to present novel ideas. So they have to find some new knowledge. And the reviewers will actually judge the article based on this. And so if you're going to get a publication, for example, in Science magazine, which is kind of the high point of publishing, it has to be both well done science, has to have good experiments that have been done, but it also has to present something new, something that nobody else has discovered. And not just novel, but it has to be an area that everybody's interested in. And so it's very competitive to get published through this kind of traditional model. As I said before, authors might be required to revise their article for publication. In some cases, reviewers might ask them to go back and do another experiment or correct something that was described incorrectly. Now, the problem with this kind of traditional way of publishing is that it's slow, it's not always successful. But in some cases, it can be expedited. So if you have a hot topic, such as coronavirus research, which is a hot topic now, you might have a very quick turnaround, say maybe in a week. So that is possible, but it's sometimes a slow process. But the good thing from your standpoint is having a peer-reviewed article means that someone else has gone through and judged the quality of the article. And in this more traditional process, they have also judged whether it actually contributes significantly to the field. So that kind of curates the knowledge that is being presented to you. So you want to, when you do searches, you want to focus on peer review articles. Okay. So one of the ways that you can identify peer-reviewed articles, I'll go into more details about this in a second, but is shown here. If you look through the publication, it'll have information about the article. This is from the publisher's website. It tells you what date it was received, and it tells you what date it was accepted. And generally, that's an indication that the article at least went through some type of editorial review. Now, as I mentioned, in some cases where you have a hot topic, something's been submitted from a laboratory that has a good track record of publications, then the review might be expedited, which it definitely was here. So here, within less than a week, they turned around and got their article accepted, and then a couple months later, it ended up being published. Okay. Now, more recently, in the past, I guess 15 years or so, 20 years, there's been a change in kind of the landscape of publications. And this is kind of a combination of a couple of things that are going on. One is that NIH and other funding organizations or agencies have started requiring that research that they fund be open access. That means that the general public can access the articles without having to pay for subscription charges. And this has led to the development of journal publishers that focus on an open access model. So that means that the articles that are published in an open access journal are freely accessible to the public. Now, the publishers can't do this for free. So instead of you paying for an article or paying for a subscription to a journal, or your library, for example, paying for a subscription to the journal, instead, in this case, the authors have to pay. So they pay what are called article processing charges or page charges. And so they actually pay for publication. Two examples of this, which are highly respected journals, PLOS, which has a number of different journals. The first one was called PLOS One, Scientific Reports. Both of these are open access journals. They do go through peer review, and in some cases they actually publish the peer review comments. So if you find an article in PLOS One, for example, you can actually find out what were the reviewer comments. This is an article from PLOS Biology, which is one of the PLOS publications, and down here at the bottom you can see it says peer review. So if you click on that tab, you can actually see what were the peer review comments, and you can see how the authors might have addressed those comments. So this provides some more transparency. It also provides very easy access for you, for the person who's trying to find information. It does have the drawback that whoever is publishing has to actually pay for the article to be published. But if they are hopefully a funded laboratory that's doing research, they have planned for and accounted for that. So this is kind of a newer model for publishing research. And even now, some of the traditional publications are moving to sort of a hybrid model where they include some open access as well as the kind of traditional model for publication. Okay, so how can you identify a peer review article? So a couple of ways of kind of identifying that. Hold on a second. Let's see. Getting noise coming from. What is that noise? Oh, sorry. My apologies. That is. Not sure where that noise is coming from. We'll maybe try to edit that out. Okay, so back to this presentation. So how do you identify a peer review article? And importantly, one thing I haven't really described is avoid what are called predatory journals. Because there is a lot of pressure to publish, and because traditionally it has not been always easy to publish, some people have, or some organizations, publishers have set up what are called predatory journals, which don't do a lot of peer review, or maybe don't do any peer review, but they will publish articles for a fee. So that's one of the things you want when you're just starting off doing research. You want to avoid relying on predatory journals because they might publish an article that has not been peer reviewed. It doesn't have an expert opinion as to whether the findings are significant. It doesn't have an expert opinion as to whether the experiments are technically sound. So that's one of the reasons I'm highlighting that you want to look for peer-reviewed scientific articles. So how can we try to focus on that? One is to use trusted databases for searches. Databases will usually limit access to some of the predatory journals. And I'll show when we get to doing searches, some of the databases that you might use. The other is to focus on the journal titles. So for instance, Science and Nature are some of the preeminent journals in the world. So you know that anything that is published in Science or Nature is going to be peer reviewed and very carefully looked over. Publications that are coming from the American Chemical Society, such as Biochemistry, Journal of the American Chemical Society, all of those articles go through peer review, or at least editorial review for particular hot topics. The same thing with Elsevier, Cell Press, EMBO, FASIB. Any articles that are submitted to those publishers are going to go through peer review. The other thing you can do is look at the article itself. So if you look at the article that you've brought up, you can look for evidence that it's gone that it's gone through a peer review process. And so in this particular article, towards the bottom of the article in the appendix, Appendix A, it has supplementary data. So it has a reference to additional supplementary data that you can find online. And then below that here, it has the date that the article was received. So this was received back on 23rd of March. It went through review, obviously, because it was revised. So reviewers looked at it. They had some questions. They had some things they wanted addressed. And so on April 6th, they resubmitted the article with revisions. And then the next day, the editor decided, okay, that addresses the reviewer comments, and accepted it. And then it appeared almost 2 weeks later, available online. So this is good evidence the article went through a review process, went through a rigorous, although this is a quick review process, it still went through a rigorous review process and had to be revised. So you want to look for those notations when you're looking for a research article. Okay, so now how do we actually find a research article? I mentioned using trusted databases. A good place to start would be PubMed. So the National Library of Medicine hosts PubMed. It also has PubMed Central, which is a little more chaotic, but it is useful because it has everything that's listed in PubMed Central are free articles. So you can search for references through PubMed Central. If you're doing research in something that's, say, more organic chemistry oriented, you might want to use Scifinder Database. That's actually published by the American Chemical Society and includes it's derived from the Chemical Abstract Service. So that's a good place to start. One drawback from using that is that it's a proprietary database, which means you have to pay for it, or you have to be associated or have access to a library that's paying for a subscription. Most university libraries will have a subscription to Scifinder. Other databases that are useful, the Web of Science, which is published through Thomson Reuters. That's a good place to find additional references. If you've already found a reference that's interesting, Web of Science is kind of the most diligent about finding other citations. So if you have a journal article, it'll have a bibliography. All the articles within that bibliography will be listed in the Web of Science. And then in addition to that, Web of Science keeps track of other articles that cited that original research article. So say, for instance, you found an original research article that is interesting to you, that discovered something in your field of study. Maybe it's from 10 years ago. Well, if you go to Web of Science, you can put in that article, title, and authors, and then it'll pull up and show you a list of all of the other articles that have cited that particular article. And so you can find out for the last 10 years, all of the other different laboratories that have been doing research in the field and found that article useful. And sometimes that's a good place to go to collect additional research articles that might be interesting to you. You can also go to the university library. There's usually a database search mechanism. We have Journal Finder at Kimball Library that you can, if you're off campus, you can log in, you still have access to. That'll allow you to access articles that way. You can also use Google Scholar. Google Scholar has a large database of articles. One caveat to that is that it's not curated. Databases such as PubMed are curated, whereas Google Scholar, you might have some articles that show up in there that may not go through peer review. So you have to be careful about that. And then the other way that you can find articles is by doing a paper chase. Basically, find an article that was published recently that is, focuses on the area of knowledge that you're trying to learn more about. And you can look at the bibliography, just as I mentioned before for a review article. You can look at the bibliography and identify other research articles that might be interesting. And as I just described, you can use that citation to go through Web of Science and find other articles that cited that research article. So this is kind of what I call paper chase, where you're using a reference to find other references, as opposed to putting in a search term in PubMed. In some cases, you can find more interesting or more useful information using a paper chase method, because you're really focusing on what everybody else is talking about in that field. What other articles are they citing? It's a good way of identifying what are some of the most important research findings in a particular field. Okay, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to actually use the databases in PubMed. It's, at least when you first start using it, it's just like using Google. You put in a search term, you find some information. Sometimes when you start reading articles, you'll find, hey, maybe I didn't use the best search term for searching PubMed. You can go back and use something that's a little more directed towards the area of research that you're interested in. Okay, so once you found a research article, how do you go about understanding it? And this is a lot different than, say, finding a newspaper article. In a newspaper article, you read it from beginning to end, focusing on what's at the beginning, and you'll get useful information that way. If you try doing that with a research article, you'll probably put yourself to sleep, get very confused, or both. So you do have to pick kind of a strategy for how you digest a research article. Research articles usually have a defined format. Most research articles will follow what's called an IMRD structure, which means there's going to be an introduction, There's going to be a section on methods that were used for the study. There's a section on results and a section on discussion. And so kind of an expansion on that, most research articles will have an abstract, the introduction, materials and methods, results, discussion. In some cases, these two results and discussion might be combined. Some articles will have a conclusion, which can be helpful, especially if you're just getting started. And then last, they'll have a bibliography, which is a good way of finding other research articles. So some questions. Should I read a whole article from beginning to end? I've kind of already answered that. No, probably not a good idea. Where do you start reading? If you don't understand what they're describing, what should you do? So where you start reading, usually you start with the abstract. And if you don't understand the area, you'll start looking at the introduction. If you don't understand what they're describing, usually it's a good idea to start with the introduction. The introduction should give you background information. The introduction is also a good place to find a review article that might give you a better description of what they're talking about. So if you start running into trouble understanding what they're talking about in paper, that's a good place to go. And then once you start thinking about doing experiments, say you want to do one of the experiments that is listed in the article. In this case, you would look at the materials and methods section where they should describe the experiments that are done. But in most cases, what you'll find is that not all the information you need is there. So you actually have to go and look at references within the materials and methods and look for papers that focus on protocols. And you can find a more clear description of how to do a particular experiment, because not all the details that you need will be usually included in the materials and methods. Now, what if you can't access the article? Now, I've tried to focus on searching for articles that are available for free, but in some cases there's a key article that you might not be able to get to for free. If you have an association with a university library, you might be able to access the article through that. If not, there is another method that you can do, and that is to send an email, send a message to the author, identify the corresponding author and send a message and say, hey, I'm interested in your article. Can you send me a copy? And in most cases, they will oblige and they'll send you a copy of their article, or they'll point you to a reference where you can find it. But in most cases, it's usually nowadays easy to find articles for free online. Okay, so a little more details as to how to digest an article. First thing you want to do is skim over the article, see what the structure of the article is. As I mentioned, most articles will follow this IMRD structure. But if you look at an article that's published in, say, Science or Nature, they're written in a very different format. They do not necessarily are not necessarily divided up into sections. In some case, they combine their introduction with results and discussion, and things kind of get mixed up together because they're written for a different audience. They're written for people who just want a very quick overview and highlights of what are their important findings. And they might send you elsewhere for more details, including supplementary information that you might need to look at. But for a traditional article, one of the first things you want to do is look at the abstract. If you do a search in PubMed, the abstract shows up in PubMed, so you can read over the abstract and focus on a couple of things. Focus on what was the purpose of their research, what methodology did they use. They should also highlight what are the results they found. And at the end of the abstract, there should be a conclusion. What does it mean? To put it in context for the field of study. So after reading the abstract, if you're interested in that particular area of knowledge, then you can start off by reading the introduction. And if you're just getting started in a particular research area, this is a good place to start. The introduction is kind of like a mini review, and it should give you all of the background that you need to understand that research article. And it's also supposed to be designed to get you interested in reading the article. So it should tell you what is already known about this area of research. It should highlight some previous work that is important. And then it should also direct you to what is the question that they're trying to answer. What's their hypothesis that they're trying to test? After that, it's a good idea to skip to the results section. The results section focuses on the experiments that they did, shows data, shows figures. It should provide a story that you can follow. They started off with this experiment. Based on what they found with this experiment, then they designed a new experiment, they did another experiment, and it should kind of step you through and focus on what the question they were trying to answer and how they were able to come to whatever answer that they found. The next section within the article is the discussion section. And this really gives you context. It tells you what do their results mean. Now, in some cases, the discussion and results sections are combined together. And so they'll present the results, and then they'll also have a discussion of that particular experiment. And then they'll move into the next experiment. They'll show the results, and then a brief discussion as to what those results are. And then in some articles, this is optional, it's not included in all research articles, there will be a conclusion. And this should tell you what the results mean, kind of in the big picture. How do their results overall, kind of looking at all the results from the paper together, how do they contribute to expanding knowledge? And so a conclusion can be very useful to look at. Now, the last section that we kind of skipped over was materials and methods. And in most cases, you won't read in the materials and methods unless you want to find out particular details about an experiment that they did. This section is difficult, if not impossible, to read from start to finish. It's usually very technical writing. It'll have a lot of jargon in it. It might not even have all the details for the methods. It might have references to other papers that have a much more detailed description of the protocols that they followed. So it's a very useful section if you're trying to understand how they did the experiments, and say maybe you want to repeat one of the experiments, or you want to do an experiment that's similar. It's a good idea to really dissect the method section then. But if you're just trying to read through the article to understand what they found, usually you'll skip over the methods section, except for maybe looking at it as a reference to see maybe a particular detail about an experiment that they did. Okay, so next, how do we cite articles? So once you've started collecting articles that you're interested in, you will probably start putting together a paper, maybe a review paper to describe a particular area of research that you're interested in. And you want to, once you start collecting citations and everything, when you start writing about them and including them in a paper that you're writing, for example, you want to make sure that you cite all of the research articles and cite the information that you are conveying to your readers. And so there are two key formats that you need to worry about. One is for in-text citations. The example here is an author and date type of format for an in-text citation. It gives the first author's name and then the date that it was published. If you're writing for a particular journal, each journal has its own defined styles for references that they prefer. So you want to check and make sure that if you're going to publish, maybe a review article in in an undergraduate research publication, for example, you want to make sure that you look at what are the reference styles that they want to see. So it'll give you a reference style for in-text citations. And then at the end of the article, you want to list all the references that you have. And the example is shown here. This has all the details about the article, because if you look at just the in-text citation, you probably have a very difficult time trying to find that article. But the bibliography reference that appears at the end of your paper should have all the details, all the authors, the title for the article, what journal it appeared in, and what's more recently a nice thing to include is a link to that article. So someone that's reading your paper can, if they're reading it online or in electronic form, they can click on that link and they can bring up the article that you referenced and look at it for more details. So these are two of the ways for including in-text citations and a list of references at the end. Okay, last thing I wanted to focus on really is how do you manage scientific literature? So it can be very tedious if you just open up Microsoft Word and start typing in your references and typing, and then when you start writing a paper, then retyping those references. So it's highly advisable to use what's called a reference manager. And there's several different options for reference managers. Endnote is one that is has a long history. I've used it in the past. One drawback for using Endnote is that it's expensive if you use the desktop version. This is actually the student price, which is still expensive. They do have a web-based version of Endnote that you can use. It's now called Endnote Basic. Another reference manager that I've used in the past is Papers, which was really nice when it first came out because it was one of the only reference managers that allowed you to download PDF files, so you could collect and organize PDF files. But now most of the other reference managers do the same thing, so there's not a big advantage to using that. There's also these last two are free options. Mendeley is actually provided by the publisher Elsevier, or Elsevier. It's free, but it requires registration. And then the last one that I'm going to focus on is Zotero. Zotero is completely free. It was developed at George Mason University. You can download it, and it's free to use. So I'm going to show you a kind of quick example of using Zotero. And so Zotero includes a reference manager program that's shown here down at the bottom. It allows you to collect different references, different research articles. It also includes a browser plugin. So if you're using, say, Chrome, it has a browser plugin for Chrome that makes it very easy to, if you're searching, say, PubMed, for example, and you find a research article and you want to put it into the reference manager, you just click on a button in your browser and it automatically downloads the reference and transfers it into Zotero. So within the reference manager itself, you have My Library, which is kind of a general organization structure. And within that, then you add different collections. And collections are basically just folders that include within those folders all of the references. So each of these references is basically an item within the folder. And those items can include references to books, articles, web pages, artwork, film, letters, manuscripts, and so on. Anything that you can find, you can include as a reference. Each item will include metadata, and this is important for when you need to put in citations in an article that you're publishing or a paper that you're working on. The metadata includes the title, the authors, publishers, dates, and so on, all the information that you need. In addition to that, though, Zotero will also download the PDF file of the research article that you're looking at. So it's, in addition to to collecting all this metadata about the authors, publishers, dates, and titles. It also includes the PDF file. So it's a good place to collect all of the articles that you want to read. And then anytime you want to go and read one, you can just go double click on the link, and then it'll open up the research article and you can read it. Now, you can add references. As I mentioned before, you can use the web browser. There's a plugin for the web browser that's called Zotero Connector. So say I'm looking for an article in PubMed, and I've identified this article on phylogenetic analysis and structural modeling of the spike protein from coronavirus. Well, if this is an article that I want, I can go over here and click the little icon over here for the Zotero connector, and it downloads all the information, downloads the PDF file, and then transfers it over into Zotero. And then if I double click the title here, it pops up in a separate window. This is in Preview or Adobe Acrobat. It'll pop up the PDF file of the article, and then you can go ahead and start reading the article from there. So it's a very easy way of collecting references and allows you to organize them. Put a list of references in different folders and keep things very organized. And then it helps out a lot when you go to start writing a paper. So Zotero, the reference manager, also includes a plugin for Microsoft Word. They also have plugins for other word processors as well. And that makes adding citations to your writing very easy. So say you're going through and writing and you get to the end of the sentence here and you want to add an in-text citation. You can click on the Zotero menu here, click Add Edit Citation, and that allows you to search through your library. And you put in a search term in this little pop-up box, and it allows you to add a citation for this particular article. So that makes it very easy. Just type in a word, maybe the author's last name, and then click on a link, and it adds it into the paper that you're writing. So that's very quick and easy. And then what you're left with here, you've got an in-text citation. So this is actually in Microsoft Word. It puts in an in-text citation. And there's a database link that's embedded in that in-text citation. And then the next thing you could do when you're finished writing your paper, say you want to create a bibliography, you click Add Edit Bibliography up here within the Zotero menu, and that'll create a whole bibliography. It'll look through all the in-text citations and then create a formatted and sorted bibliography at the end of your paper. And what's really useful about this is that you can pick any style of citations that you want. So for instance, APA style is commonly used for term papers. You can select that. Or you can change the citation style. If you don't like APA style, you can select a different citation style, and it will reformat the paper and reformat all the citations without you having to go through and type each individual citation. So it saves a lot of time when you're writing a paper. So I highly recommend that. The last thing I just wanted to leave off with is creating an annotated bibliography. This is a good strategy for when you're doing literature search and you're trying to learn about an area. As you go through and read articles, you can take notes, and you can put this together as an annotated bibliography. So you can find out, what information did you learn from this article. You can include that in the annotation for the bibliography. The annotated bibliography should have the full reference, so it's easy to find that article. And then below that, you just put in your notes, a synopsis of what you found useful from that article. And if you come up, you can put together 10 or 20 different research articles and include annotations for each of those. And then when you go to actually write a paper, it makes it much easier to find out, okay, where did I find useful information? What references do I want to include in the introduction to the article that I'm writing? This is a very useful technique for organizing information and extracting what you need. And that is all I wanted to talk about today, so we'll stop there.